Okay, welcome. We'll go ahead and get started. Glad to have everybody with us today. This is a great occasion and a timely one. This is the WCD Roundtable on Constraining Presidents. And this roundtable is part of the University of Michigan's Democracy and Debate theme semester that was originally built around the idea that we would have a presidential debate at Michigan this year. That didn't happen for COVID-related reasons. But we're delighted nonetheless to have this be part of that theme semester. And this will also, the views of our panelists will also be incorporated into a special issue of the Democracy and Autocracy newsletter that will be coming out early next year. I want to thank our primary sponsor, which is the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, and thank its director, Professor Dan Slater, for helping conceive and organize this event. And also like to thank the Weiser Diplomacy Center and African Studies Center for their co-sponsorship. And let me express also thanks to Professor Rob Mickey and Derek Groom for all their work in support of today's roundtable. So we're here to talk today about constraining presidents, and I dearly wish that this roundtable was a little more academic and a little less timely. Right? But as we're all aware, over the last few years, the headlines domestically, internationally, have been filled with talk of challenges to democracy. And these challenges go by a variety of different names: autocratization, democratic backsliding, democratic decline. But regardless of the label, it's clear that the global advance of democracy that was the norm through much of the last 40 years has not only come to a halt, but actually appears to be reversing. And we've entered what some have called a third wave of autocratization. And as our panelists will discuss today, this move towards greater autocratization is happening both in democracies, as democracies become less democratic, less liberal, and also in autocracies, as electoral autocracies become more closed and move in that direction. There's several distinguishing features of the current wave of autocratization, but one which has been the focus of a lot of scholarly attention is the central role that executives and presidents, including elected executives, often play in this process. In what some scholars term executive aggrandizement or executive takeovers, the current generation of autocratizers often leave the trappings of democracy in place, but then hollow out democracy or electoral autocracy from the inside. They don't abrogate the Constitution, they don't suspend elections, they don't shutter Parliament. Indeed, a defining feature of executive aggrandizement is that the aggrandizers claim to be operating under the charge of an electoral mandate and within constitutional limits. These executives undertake a series of normative and institutional changes designed to weaken the checks on executive power, while at the same time working to hamper the power of opposition forces to challenge executive power. And again, it's important to emphasize that most of these actions are presented as taking place within the bounds of the Constitution and the rule of law. So given the central role that executives play in these developments, we wanted to assemble a group of scholars who approached questions about how to constrain executives from a variety of different theoretical, methodological, and empirical perspectives. And so we're delighted to be joined today by a wonderful group of scholars: William Howell, Ann Meng, Julia Azari, Ken Opalo, and Kenneth Lowande. And I'll introduce them each in turn, but I wanted to note that on this roundtable, we have scholars who work both in American and comparative politics, scholars who work primarily in democratic contexts, and also those who focus on autocracies, and scholars who work on sort of with a contemporary focus, and those who take a more historical point of view. So we're looking forward to this really fruitful discussion from these different scholars as they each share their own perspective. Let me also welcome members of our audience. We're looking forward to your questions and your comments today, and we're going to have time for those questions. Each of our panelists will give some brief opening remarks, and then we'll open the floor for discussion and questions. And you can submit questions anytime via the Q&A link on your screen. First up today, we're going to hear from William Howell. Professor Howell is the Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics at the University of Chicago, where he holds appointments in the Harris School, the Political Science Department, and the college. Currently, he's the chair of the Political Science Department, the director of the Center for Effective Government, and the co-host of Not Another Politics podcast. William's written widely on separation of powers issues, American political institutions, especially the presidency, and his most recent book is Presidents, Populism, and the Crisis of Democracy, which he co-authored with Terry Moe, and which came out from University of Chicago Press just earlier this year. I will turn the time over to William.
Thanks, Alan. What a pleasure to be a part of this terrific group. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation that's going to ensue. I'm going first, so I'm going to try to just say some I want to identify kind of two broad themes that I suspect will carry through the conversation moving forward, with hopes of setting the table a little bit. And the first has to do with how we evaluate how powerful presidents are. And the second has to do with how we evaluate possible reforms that one might want to think about that might check or constrain the exercise of executive authority. And so let me take them in turn. The first having to do with, are presidents weak or are they strong, right? And I'm speaking here in the context of, so I study American politics, US presidents, kind of panning back, not just vis-a-vis Trump, but past presidents as well. Are they weak or are they strong? The answer is yes and yes, right? It's all but impossible to talk about the American presidency when thinking about presidential power and not speak out of both sides of your mouth. And the one thing that we can be sure of when we talk about the presidency is that if you speak in categorical terms, you're wrong. You're at least inviting a rebuke, and a justified one at that. So, and we see this just when we look back on the last 3.5, 4 years with regard to Trump and Trump's presidency. We can tell a story about Trump having these unbelievable ambitions, and planning to build great and glorious walls and upend the democratic order and radically drain the swamp and finally pass comprehensive immigration reform and overturn the Affordable Care Act and give us an altogether new healthcare system, and on and on. And he's been rebuked at nearly every turn. He's been rebuked by his subordinates within the administrative state. He's been rebuked by legislators. He's been rebuked by the courts, by the broader public. He's faced resistance at every turn. And so if you evaluate Trump, frankly, on Trump's own terms, what you might say is he's actually really weak. One story. Another story is this is a president who has used his unilateral powers to considerable effect, has radically altered not just the content of and the force of the regulatory state, but the shape of the administrative state. He's had a dramatic impact on democratic norms and on the health of our democracy itself. He has shaped our politics and Republican politics in ways that are profound. Our relationship to foreign countries have been not just disrupted, but reconfigured in ways that are going to present profound challenges to Biden when he assumes office. President Trump is remarkably powerful. Both those things are true. And so I think much of, frankly, the debate when it comes to the scholarship on the American presidency has been a sort of camps saying no, they're really powerful, and other camps saying no, they're beleaguered and they work at the margins. And the truth of the matter is that everybody has a claim to truth in this space. First point. Second point is that we ought to think about how we evaluate what powers presidents have. It isn't just a story, to my mind, about whether or not they're too strong or too weak, right? And that what we ought to be thinking about is how do we find that happy medium? That's not an especially helpful question. To my mind, the helpful question to ask, and it's one that in the book that Terry and I ask, both in the last two books that we've written together, so the most recent one was President's Populism and the Crisis of Democracy, has to do with how do you leverage the distinct kind of leadership that presidents stand to offer in ways that are responsible. So it's not just about, are they too powerful or not, and how do we constrain them? It's that presidents offer a kind of leadership that John Dearborn, he's got a terrific book coming out in, I don't know, it's going to be out in the next year or so. He calls it Presidential Representation. It has to do with the capacity of presidents to represent national interests, to pay attention to the long-term implications of policy change, and to offer a distinct kind of leadership in our national politics that can be understood apart from the kind of representation that we observe within Congress, which pays more attention to short-term local considerations. And there's real promise in that. And that's a kind of leadership, frankly, that we need if we're going to make headway on the challenges that we as a country face, challenges involving climate change, involving rising inequality between the rich and the poor, involving an incoherent tax code and a mess of an immigration system. Okay, so there's like, we need presidential leadership. And it isn't just that we need strong presidents because they can break through the gridlock and kind of provide the energy, some generic notion of like energy that is injected into a system of separated powers that privileges the status quo. It's that they channel different kinds of interests. They represent different kinds of notion about what good policy looks like, and that we need that on the one hand. On the other hand, what stands behind a lot of concerns about the Trump presidency, what stands behind our gathering and this interest in constraining presidents is a recognition that presidents, when they act as demagogues, can do extraordinary damage to the health of our democracy. They represent a very real threat, and that there's cause to fear presidents just as they offer real promise. And so I guess in my short time together, I think what I would like to counsel is that then when we think about redesigning the presidency, and not just the presidency itself, but redesigning and reimagining the constraints that we would want to put on the presidency, it should be with an eye towards, again, not edging towards some, not too hot, not too cold, plain vanilla moderation, but thinking anew about how do you leverage on the one hand the promise, but not fall victim to the fear. It's a two-pronged test that we ought to be imagining when we try to reconstitute the presidency and the checks that are put on it, because that's precisely what we need to be doing. Because, and then on this I'll end, it seems to me the core lesson of the Trump presidency is that, one, presidents can do extraordinary damage. It's by reference to what Trump has done over the course of his time in presidency to our democracy that we should be concerned about the health of our democracy and want to set to work on institutional reform. But two, it's also by reference to what he's revealed, our dependence on norms, which we didn't adequately appreciate in order to govern. These kinds of things may not be adequate, and so we would be well served to set our sights towards institutional rejuvenation, institutional reforms in the coming months and years. And I just want to suggest that this is the right test for us to think about when it comes to presidential power and reconstituting the presidency for modern times. So with that, I'll stop and hand it off to you, Alan, to introduce the next person.
Thank you very much, William. Just want to remind everybody that you can post questions or comments anytime you'd like in the Q&A on the Q&A panel. And as speakers are speaking, you can go ahead and post those. Our next presenter is Julia Azari. Professor Azari is an associate professor and assistant chair in the Department of Political Science at Marquette University. She holds a PhD, an MA, and an MPhil degree in political science from Yale University and a BA in political science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her research and teaching interests include the American presidency, American political parties, and the politics of the American state, and qualitative research methods. Professor Azari is a regular contributor at the political science blog, The Mischiefs of Faction. Her work has also appeared in the Washington Post's Monkey Cage blog and in Politico. Turn the floor over to Professor Azari.
Great, thank you so much for including me on this wonderful panel. So I'm going to continue by talking about the American presidency, and I think my sense of the ways in which the power of the American presidency is multidimensional are similar to what Will said before. I'm going to talk about this in terms of several different dimensions and how these dimensions have played out over time, and situate this in the field of American political development. So I think that historically there have been three different ways that scholars and that practitioners have thought about presidential weakness and strength in the US context. And the first is constraining the office, and specifically constraining the office from encroaching on legislative territory. The second is constraining the individual. And then the third veers in a separate direction, which is the impulse to use the presidency to improve governing capacity. And so my argument is that the tools that we've developed for the first two the first two categories, and for those kinds of constraints, are actually inadequate to the presidency that's been built in service of that third goal. To start with the legislative territory, here I think the main kind of question that emerged around the time of the American founding and still is pressing today is the role of presidential war powers. And here you have this kind of, again, kind of jurisdictional set of debates about what can the president do? What is the president allowed to do? Can the president initiate certain kinds of conflicts or hostilities? Can the president, as early as George Washington, we were talking about whether the president can abrogate treaties. And here I would say for the first, up until the 1940s and 1950s, you could probably give the system like maybe a B. I've been grading midterms, so I think I'm just going to give a grade to the American political system here. There were instances in which you did see the other institutions push back, particularly because Congress had a more robust understanding of itself and its kind of constitutional territory. So to reach back into the 19th century for examples of this, the Supreme Court, while unable to constrain Abraham Lincoln directly in the Civil War, did issue decisions that constrained his decisions about habeas corpus and other war powers from becoming major precedent for later presidents. So you see the courts interpreting the Constitution in ways that constrain the presidency. You also saw this with Congress pushing back on James K. Polk in the context of the beginning of the Mexican War, when he called on Congress for a declaration, and Congress responded with a declaration, but also with a reassertion of their prerogative and in that regard. In domestic affairs, we also see some of this. And to reference a topic that's been kind of in the news recently, when FDR announced that he was going to put forward a plan to change the structure of the Supreme Court, you saw some pushback specifically from Congress, because that was their kind of territory. I think we've seen this really erode. We've seen this erode as America's role in the world has changed, as the federal government has grown, and also as Congress has become, I think, less of a kind of assertive institution in these inner branch fights. But those structures did exist, and this did work once. And I think that's important as we think about what's there to constrain the president now, and also, again, how our previous thinking about these kinds of problems is not adequate to the nature of the problems that we face, or at least all of the problems that we face today. The second one is how to constrain individuals. And here I think you do see a kind of gap between constitutional thinking and founding thinking and some of what's unfolded in the interim. This was definitely a concern at the founding, how to keep the presidency from concentrating power too much in one individual. And this is very much a temporal way of thinking, how to ensure power and continuity in government, and also constrain one individual from holding office for too long. And here again, I think I would give our kind of historical system about a B. Having political parties that have different factions has been a very helpful feature in constraining individual presidents, has certainly kept them from hanging on to office for too long. And then ultimately laws have also been very effective here. Elections have been very effective. It bears saying on this day that incumbent presidents who have lost the presidency have conceded and left. And the instances where this doesn't work have really been standouts. Presidents like Andrew Johnson governing after the Civil War and allowing his personal hangups and personality flaws and racism to be incorporated in government, and the impeachment process was not quite adequate to constrain that. And similarly, Richard Nixon, ultimately removed from office, ultimately through resignation, but also a person whose kind of personal issues became everybody's problem. And so you start to see the ways in which the Constitution and the political system don't really constrain individual presidents in real time under all conditions. So again, kind of a B. And I think the Trump administration brings up that question as well of the adequacy of our parties, our elections, and our laws in constraining a president who is determined not to be constrained. But the third trajectory in American politics is not one of constraint, right? It's a set of thoughts about how the presidency should evolve that have to do with improving governing capacity. And this is really kind of resonant with what Will was saying before about the need for a national office to address national problems. And this is where we start to see the growth of the presidency and the administrative state, starting around the progressive era, early part of the 20th century, and then into the FDR period. You see the buildup of presidential power as a majoritarian tool, right? As a tool to make the national government more responsive in response to the inadequacies of Congress. And this was not only Wilson's political and governing project, but also his academic work. And some of the changes there have been to build out the executive branch and build out the presidency, specifically to create the presidency as an institution where you have people working within the executive office of the president and the White House on specific policy issues who are responsive directly to the president, and in some cases not directly responsive to Congress, not members of the cabinet without that kind of independence. We also see the buildup of the president as more informally as the focal point of the party system. And these, I think, were distinct developments in the middle of the 20th century. But over the course of the 20th and eventually 21st century, they've merged into one. And so we have this presidency that has deliberately been built out as an institution to respond to the need for national policy, and also at the same time the kind of nationalization and presidentialization of the party system. And this means that we now have a presidency that can engage in what I'm calling partisan consolidation. And I kind of drafted this yesterday afternoon, and I feel like it's aged pretty well in the last day or so, in the sense that we not only see the ability of presidents to use executive orders and signing statements to further their partisan ends, but they can govern through personnel and enforcement, shape the contours of their party stances. And this is not the kind of thing that the Constitution or our previous institutional developments have a response to. This problem is the convergence of two deliberate developments to answer yet another problem. So that's I have some very vague ideas about how to solve that, but I will end it here as I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, and hopefully we'll have a chance to get into how to solve some of those things. Next, we're going to turn to Professor Ann Meng. Professor Meng is an assistant professor in the politics department at the University of Virginia. Her research centers on authoritarian politics and institutions and elite power sharing. Her new book, Constraining Dictatorship: From Personalized Rule to Institutionalized Regimes, examines how executive constraints become established in dictatorships, particularly within constitutions and presidential cabinets. Her new work focuses on autocratic backsliding and executive aggrandizement in non-democracies, and she's also published articles on authoritarian ruling parties, term limit evasion, and leadership succession. She received her PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley, and we're delighted to have Professor Meng with us today. Ann?
Great, thank you so much, Alan. Thanks so much for putting this panel together. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. I love it when comparativists and Americanists get smushed together. It's always a lot of fun. And I really like thinking about America comparatively, because I get to talk about how authoritarian our US history is. So that's always fun for me. Okay, so I actually have a few slides. I'm going to go ahead and share that right now. All right, can everybody see that? Okay, perfect. So as Alan mentioned, my research focuses on authoritarian regimes. So what I'm going to be thinking about today is how autocratic presidents are constrained. Basically, how do we constrain dictators, right? Dictators always call themselves presidents, whether or not they were actually elected. So just a really quick note on kind of what we currently think. So one of the main arguments that's come out on the literature on authoritarian regimes, in part I think coming from looking at how democratic regimes work, is that, scholars originally thought that nominally democratic institutions, so things like parties and legislatures, played an important role in limiting presidential power. However, it turns out, I would argue that these nominally democratic institutions are often not as effective at tying the hands of presidents and dictatorships as we might have thought. So first of all, these nominally democratic institutions, things like parties, legislatures, and constitutions, have always been extremely common in dictatorships. And this is not just a post-Cold War phenomena, right? So the graph on the left basically shows the percentage of dictatorships that had these institutions in place, and the majority of dictatorships have had these types of democratic seeming institutions pretty much since the end of World War II. Another problem with relying on these nominally democratic institutions to tie the hands of leaders is that there's a lot of variation in institutional strength. And Ken is going to talk a lot more about this, right? But a lot of institutions in autocracies are really weak. So I've looked specifically at the strength of ruling parties, and it turns out that most ruling parties in dictatorships don't survive in power past the death or departure of the founding leader. So that's what the graph on the right shows, right? So it turns out that a lot of these ruling parties are really just kind of attached to a charismatic leader and don't have very much organizational strength or autonomy, right? So we really can't rely on these seemingly democratic institutions to credibly constrain presidents. Okay, so then the question is, what does make an effective executive constraint in autocracies, right? So here I argue that we really just need to look directly at constitutional rules that limit executive power. So I look both at kind of formal constitutional rules, and I also argue that cabinet appointments can be a very effective kind of indirect or informal way of constraining presidents through power sharing. However, I wanted to highlight a challenge that is very specific in the autocratic context, which is that it's really hard to have credible commitment power in autocracies, right? Because if a dictator can create an institution, why can't he just eliminate the institution the next day, right? What makes for credible commitment power in autocracies? So I argued that the solution here is that institutions have to actually change the underlying distribution of power in order to credibly constrain presidents, right? So it's not about the creation of de facto rules on paper. It's about actually changing de jure power, right? So presidents are credibly constrained when elites are actually empowered. Okay, so how exactly does that happen then, right? Like, how do we come up with these constraints that actually empower elites and change underlying de jure power? In my work, I have looked at basically these 4 different measures of executive constraints. Others exist out there. These are just the 4 that I've collected data on so far. So the first thing that I look at are constitutional rules that limit executive power. So the first thing we can look at are term limits, right? Whether the autocratic constitution has term limits. Maybe a slightly less kind of intuitive kind of constraint on executive power are actually leadership succession policies. So the reason why having leadership succession policies in the Constitution actually constitutes an executive constraint is because having a very specific kind of hierarchical order, for instance, when the Constitution actually names a designated successor, what it does is it essentially shifts the focus and creates a focal point, right, as the designated successor. In other words, you essentially have kind of a delegation of power, right? The leader is no longer kind of the only focal point in the regime, right? And so these things are not trivial in autocratic constitutions. Plenty of autocratic leaders actually refuse to plan for succession because they're afraid of the crown prince problem, right? So in regimes where we actually have succession policies where the leader has actually designated a formal successor, that can actually be a pretty meaningful kind of, you know, power sharing mechanism that constitutes a constraint on presidents. We can also think about informal constraints on presidents. And here I argue that we can look at power sharing through cabinet appointments. So again, I want to stress that appointing people to your cabinet, this is not a trivial thing in autocracies, okay? Autocratic leaders routinely leave key cabinet positions vacant, or they'll just eliminate the office altogether. Autocratic presidents will also sometimes name themselves as their cabinet ministers, right? So autocratic presidents will sometimes name themselves as their own vice presidents or their own defense ministers. In a really extreme example, one president actually named himself to a third of all the cabinet positions, right? So being willing to appoint elites to your cabinet is not a trivial power sharing mechanism in the authoritarian context. So what I did was I focused on the appointment of an elite to two of the most important cabinet positions, the position of the vice president and the position of the defense minister, right? So the vice president is essentially the #2 position in the regime. The vice president is often the constitutionally designated successor. So obviously this is an extremely important position. The defense minister, who is in charge of the entire military, is also an extremely powerful position, especially given the fact that autocratic leaders are often deposed in coups, right? So who you hand the keys to the military to is highly consequential in an authoritarian regime, right? Sorry?
1 minute, Anne.
Okay, thank you. So whether presidents make these appointments and how stable these appointments are a good way of gauging how constrained the presidents are. Okay, I had these graphs of Africa, but actually, so what I'm going to do with my remaining minute is for my book project, I had collected data on what those constraints looked like in sub-Saharan Africa from 1960 to 2010. I am currently collecting data on all countries in the world, so not just Africa, and actually not just autocracies, so also in democracies. And the data goes until 2018, but I'm actually, the data soon will go up to 2020. So what's nice about this is that it kind of lets us look at the state of these executive constraints today. Okay, so this is very preliminary and I still have a bunch of missing data. So just kind of take these graphs with a grain of salt. But this is what these kind of power sharing via cabinet appointments look like. So the graphs on the left are democracies, the graphs on the right are autocracies. So I looked both at the mean percentage of opposition cabinet appointments per year, as well as the proportion of countries with a defense minister appointed. So the one thing that I think is important to stress with these preliminary graphs is that it actually seems like power sharing via cabinet appointments has not disappeared, right? If anything, within autocracies, they actually seem to have increased, you know, in the last couple of years. We see similar trends when we look at formal executive constraints. So here I look at term limits as well as leader duration. So as you can see, you know, for autocracies, there's been kind of a mild dip in the percentage of countries with constitutional term limits, but it has not returned to pre-1990 levels, right? And in fact, what I show with the graphs at the bottom is that average leader tenure has actually been going down, right? So it's not that leaders, since 2016 have just all gotten rid of term limits and are just all staying in office forever now, right? So the kind of last thing that I'll say is, I think that this data, at least just this data that I've collected here on these kind of couple different dimensions of executive constraints, suggests that these constraints have actually held up reasonably well recently. So I'm not necessarily saying that democratic erosion or autocratic backsliding isn't happening. I think the most important takeaway here is that I think they've been happening this whole time, right? Leaders did not just suddenly start to remove constraints in 2016, right? This is something that has always happened, and democratic backsliding is not a new thing that just, emerged with Donald Trump's presidency, right? So I think that that's kind of the one big takeaway that I see, at least with this kind of initial data collection on global executive constraints. So I will stop there and stop sharing my screen. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anne. Just want to remind the audience that you can submit questions anytime through the Q&A button down below on your Zoom screen. We welcome questions or comments from you. Our next presenter is Ken Opalo. Professor Opalo is an assistant professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. His research interests include legislative politics, subnational administration, and local government, also electoral politics and the political economy of development in Africa. His first book, titled Legislative Development in Africa, Politics and Post-Colonial Legacies, was published last year by Cambridge University Press, and it explores how the adaptation of inherited colonial legislative institutional forms and practices continue to structure and influence contemporary politics and policy outcomes in Africa. Ken earned his BA from Yale University and his PhD from Stanford, and we are delighted to have him with us today. Ken, floor is to you.
Thank you, Alan, and great to be part of this panel today. As Alan mentioned, I study legislatures, and so I'll be thinking about presidential constraints from the perspective of legislative institutions. And I'll provide examples of legislatures from Kenya and Zambia, and perhaps speak to some of the points that have been raised by both Julia and Will in the opening session. Okay, so this is a variant of the graph that Anne just shared, which is showing the prevalence of legislatures in both autocracies and democracies around the world. And what I'm showing here is the proportion of countries that in any given year had a functional legislature. Right, and one of the main findings of the literature on autocratic institutions is that many autocrats govern with institutions, and as you can see here, many of these countries at independence, many of the post-colonial states inherited colonial legislatures. They went through a rough period of making those legislatures work. In some instances, there were incompatibilities between legislatures and presidents proceeded to basically just shut down the legislatures. But after those conflicts or intra-elite conflicts were resolved, you've seen a steady rise in the proportion of countries that have functional legislative institutions. So that now, the idea of the three branches of government is pretty widespread, and autocracies and democracies alike have legislative institutions. And in my book and ongoing work, I make the case that these institutions make a difference, even when they exist in autocracies. Okay, and because legislatures make a difference, I'd like to think through, what are the sources of legislative power, and how should we think about the potential for legislatures to serve as a constraint on executive authority. The first source of legislative power is the constitutional rules that separate powers and also separate mandate. All right, so most constitutions limit the legislative authority to parliament or other legislative institutions. in many countries, presidents and parliaments are elected separately, right? And this provides a separation of mandate, a point that Will and Julia alluded to. This notion that the president represents a national constituency, while individual legislators represent much smaller districts. That separates the issues that they care about. And because there is a structural difference in the issues that presidents and individual legislators care about, that necessarily in many cases creates sort of a conflict over both distribution of power and resources. And so this provides a constraint on presidents, because the president's sort of interests, often informed, in a stylized idea of this, informed by the preferences of pivotal or median voters, may not match onto individual legislators' preferences, because the median voter at the constituency level is often different from the median voter at the national level. And so this provides a structural sort of source of legislative opposition, if you will, to the presidency, and therefore a source of constraint. Beyond the constitutional or legal constraints on presidential power, I also focus quite a bit in my research on the political sources of legislative strength. And I think especially because we live in a world that's defined by norms and traditions, and those norms actually do a lot of heavy lifting in making or giving life to constitutional stipulations. It's important to consider the political bases of individual legislators' strength and their overall institutional capacity to constrain presidents. Now, in the context of low-income countries or developing countries that I studied in Africa, right, some of the things that we may take for granted in the US context do not always obtain, right? So, just the very simple question of budgets, all right? Who controls the legislative budget? Forget about, power of the purse for now. Like, can legislators, choose a budget or enact a budget that's sufficient to pay legislators a livable wage, to hire staff, and to beef up the legislative institutions? Now, legislators that are able to do this, right, can then begin to develop the organizational capacity that will allow them to do the research needed for oversight and for legislation. Now, the big source of legislative power is a question of calendar and agenda autonomy. Now, in most countries, right, presidents often have the power to initiate legislation, and that kind of can limit the extent to which individual members present the constituents' interest. All right, so if the president controls the legislative calendar and agenda more broadly, it limits the enactment of this separation of mandate dynamic, so that members are always second movers to the president. Now, in situations where legislators can determine their own calendar, determining things as simple as how many days can you meet in a given year. All right, there's quite a bit of variation in global constitutions onto this. We may take it for granted that Congress, the leadership in Congress in the U.S. determines when and how often members meet. In many countries, there are constitutional limits. You can only meet for 6 months a year, or the president can unilaterally prorogue or dissolve the legislature, therefore leaving them hostage to the preferences of the president. And what you see in situations where presidents have control over the calendar, oftentimes when legislatures are about to discuss issues that may be at variance with the preferences of the president, they often just suspend parliament. We saw this in the case of Brexit, which caused a big brouhaha in the UK, but this is fairly common in many countries where presidents can determine what is discussed in plenary by threatening to suspend parliament. Now, another factor that I look at in detail in the book is this question of means independence, right? And this is sort of getting at the idea or asking the question, is it the case that when a law is being passed through Parliament, members actually take time to discuss it, or do they get orders from an extra legislative authority or entity and merely have an up or down vote on the question? Now, this is a question about the internal industrial organization of legislatures, and is another source of variation in legislative strength. In legislatures where you have members have the ability to actually debate legislation, to represent their constituents, often the executive doesn't always get their way. While in contexts where the executive basically drafts legislation and uses the legislative leadership to pass laws, you often see presidents basically usurping the lawmaking powers of legislatures. And then in some countries, parliaments have the ability or power to delegate legislative authority to presidents. Similarly, parliaments have the power to regulate executive rulemaking. In the process of enacting legislation, legislators may find reason to give rulemaking powers to the executive branch, and the ability to claw back those rules or the delegated powers is also another dimension which determines how strong the legislature gets to be vis-a-vis the president. And then finally, a very, I would argue, the most important source of political independence of legislators is this question of, do individual members have a personal vote, all right? And can they do they have personal control over their political careers? So, in a world whereby the executive can determine the political careers of individual members, either because they're independently popular or they have tight control over the party, right? Members have no choice but to be differential to the executive or president, right? You see this in both presidential or parliamentary systems. So, legislators in India, or whether you're talking about legislators in Kenya, the idea that the president can use the office of the presidency to basically win or lose elections for individual members limits the ability to stand up to the president in the course of doing their daily activities. And you see this in the US, as Julia was mentioning, right? The idea of the nationalization of the political parties in the US, the dominance of the US presidency kind of takes politics away from these local issues, pretty much gets rid of this separation of mandate as an idea, and therefore leaves individual members at the mercy of the president. And just quickly, before I conclude, I'd like to show you graphs of comparisons that I make of Kenya and Zambia in the book, basically showing you that, when you allow for means independence, that is for members to actually debate and pass legislation, presidents don't always get their way. So the solid line is the case of Kenya, dotted line is Zambia. In Zambia, you don't have much separation of mandate, means independence. In Kenya, you get means independence. And what you observe is that, following democratization, in conditions where there's means independence, you see individual members acting independent of the executive branch, something that you don't see in Zambia. I can talk more about delegated powers in the Q&A, but just to conclude on this, right, the key takeaway that I see in terms of the role of legislatures in constraining presidents is that institutions and regularized processes matter, right? So it matters that laws cannot be passed by just the stroke of the pen, that you have to pass it through the legislature. That mere process may generate new information, especially in the conditions where you have means independence, to introduce more roadblocks to presidential action. So constitutions that introduce multiple roadblocks to presidential action can actually constrain presidents. However, to get sort of the full effects, you need to consider this question of the distribution of power, right? And Anne spoke to this, right? Ultimately, what you want is a de facto distribution of power such that legislators are individually strong and have a great deal of control over their political careers, which then affords them independence when they act within the institution of the legislature. All that to say that at the end of the day, it is strong legislators that will make for a strong legislative institutions. And if the president can weaken individual legislators, then they create situations which allow them to run roughshod of legislative institutions, regardless of whatever constitutional constraints may exist. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ken. Last but not least, we are joined by Kenneth Lowande. Professor Lowande is an assistant professor of political science and public policy by courtesy at the University of Michigan and a faculty associate in the Center for Political Studies at the Institute for Social Research. Before coming to Michigan, he was a fellow in the Department of Political Science at Washington University in St. Louis, and then at the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics at Princeton University. He studies American political institutions with particular interest in presidential power, congressional oversight, and bureaucratic policymaking. Professor Lowande, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I've already learned a lot, so I'm in sort of an odd position here. I should say I'm going to talk basically about how the American president is constrained as a policymaker. One distinction we might make is, right, I'm not going to say anything about how the president is constrained in terms of ethics or sort of pure corruption, which I think deserve their own discussion. Now, again, like I said, I'm in kind of an odd position because Julia and Will have already summarized what are probably the best answers to the question of how do we constrain presidents. So I'm going to try to say something different. And for that reason, it might be kind of crazy. So bear with me. I'm going to start by showing you a descriptive figure here, right? So this is a plot of executive actions under the last 3 presidents prior to Trump. It's Clinton, Bush, and Obama. And on the y-axis is a list of different policy areas. And then on the x-axis is just time. And a darkened cell means that the president took at least one action in that year. It could have been an executive order, a proclamation, a regulation, some kind of change in enforcement emphasis, really anything that is apparently White House directed and intended to change the status quo. So this could be kind of a measure of presidents exercising their imperial or unilateral authority. So there's a lot of descriptive things that I could say about presidential power by looking at the data this way. But because our topic is, how do you constrain presidents, I want to focus on one thing, which is that if I gave you this list and you went through each of these items, I'm guessing the thing that would be most remarkable about it is how few of these actions actually lead to significant and lasting policy change, right? And without this list, it's easy to walk through a few examples of the kind of thing that I mean. So Obama designated a bunch of national monuments on his way out of office. It turns out, right, some of those designations had no impact. One of them conflicted with congressional statute. Another didn't change the actual protections that were on the books for a wilderness area. He also signed a bunch of directives aimed at combating gun violence and funding research in that area. He signed directives closing Guantanamo. Clinton signed directives on environmental justice and ones that were meant to provide new protections to rivers, all actions that ultimately had little to no impact. And the figure here is not updated to 2020, but the Trump administration is really kind of an extreme example of this, right? We didn't get mass deployment of drive-through testing centers. The hiring freeze from the beginning of the administration was quickly lifted. The administration didn't deliver military surplus to local law enforcement. They didn't control prescription drug prices. They didn't distribute special payment cards to senior citizens, though they might eventually. And all of these actions really kind of follow a similar playbook, right? The president announces some action, the media covers it, they have some sort of speech or a signing ceremony, and then later it's revealed, usually by experts who do follow-up reporting, that the action either amounted to very little or didn't have its at least intended impact. Now, I think about all these examples in response to the question of the panel, because the typical way that we think about presidential limitations is through the lens of the separation of powers, right? In American politics, it's the president might be a first mover, but it's the Congress or the courts that come in and step in and stop the president from acting. This echoes some of the things that Ken and Ann have said about legislatures too. But in all of the examples that I gave you, what seems to stop presidents from really making or behaving as dictators is more simple, right? Presidents are failing a lot because governing is really hard in practice, right? They have limited time and resources, and the amount of labor and managerial skill that's involved in executing even some of the simplest directives is really non-trivial, right? And the policy problems that we end up laying at the feet of the American president are really complicated and very difficult to solve. So I'm not saying that presidents can't get anything done by sort of acting unilaterally or behaving like dictators, and there are clear examples of executive actions that we could probably talk about in the Q&A. But what I am saying is that, in the public conversations about this topic, the real kind of transaction costs of unilateral policymaking are usually ignored. If you listen to presidential candidates, for example, or even critics of the imperial presidency, you'd think that it was easy as just kind of signing an executive order, and it's plainly not, right? So in that respect, I think there tend to be a lot more constrained than people think. Now, one potential response to this question, since this is about kind of democratic backsliding and the aggrandizement of the executive, is, okay, maybe I buy that American presidents don't have that power right now, but they're entrepreneurial, and everything that I've said so far suggests that they have an incentive to expand their authority. So maybe not now, but we're trending towards some sort of eventual situation where the size of government and the decentralized nature of government is not enough to hold the American president back. And that's plausible. It's a fairly common argument that people make. But I do question whether presidents actually have strong incentives to control government in that way, right? So in the short term, executive actions like the ones that I'm showing you are extremely useful credit claiming devices, right? Especially when your audience is the American public, which tends to be inattentive and not typically knowledgeable about these things, right? So just to put it in terms of examples, Trump might not be able to get the DLA to send armored vehicles to your local sheriff, but he signs an order and has a nice photo op with the Fraternal Order of Police. That probably gets him most of the way there politically. Some of the executive orders that were related to the environment during the Clinton administration ended up not being that impactful, but it was politically very useful to have Al Gore kind of running around the country promoting these actions during the 2000 elections, right? So for me, the thing that sometimes, and in a lot of cases, holds a president back is that these kinds of inch-deep actions are often enough to appeal to the constituency that they're cultivating, right? Oftentimes they can kind of build a political brand without resorting to the very hard task of actually governing. So for all the talk that about creating kind of new formal mechanisms of oversight, constitutional amendments, other instruments like that, all of which I think are kind of worthwhile, buckets of reforms to talk about. I think that some of the best explanations for why the American president isn't a dictator right now, and likely won't become one, at least in the near future, is that they just don't need to be, right? There's simply easier ways to get reelected and to be viewed as a good president than doing something like that. So I think with that, I'm out of time and we can open it up for questions.
Thank you. Appreciate each of the panelists and their insights. Again, just a reminder to the audience, you can post questions in the Q&A. We already have several that have come through. And so I'll just go ahead and launch right in to one of the questions. And maybe I'll direct this first one to start with, maybe to Julia, but other panelists are welcome to comment as well. So this is from Professor Slater. We learn in American school books that presidents only execute the laws. They don't make laws or have power of the purse. Does part of the problem lie in presidents' encroachment into lawmaking and budget making? Has the separation of powers perhaps inadvertently produced a concentration of powers in the presidency? And might we reverse it by returning presidents to a purely law executing role?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was thinking about this. I'm not totally sure if I'm going to end up answering this question or the one that I want to answer, because I was just thinking about this during Kenneth's presentation, which is I've kind of long had this hunch and this piece that I've been wanting to write and never have, about how it's easier for presidents. Like, presidents in the U.S. context have a lot more power to break things than they do to solve problems. I mean, to speak to the budgeting question, I see the kind of budgeting situation, and maybe someone who's a deeper expert on budgeting than I would have a different answer, but I see that as being largely part of that it's an agenda setting device for presidents, and that a lot of the enforcement power I was talking about, and implementation power, and I actually want to also ask the comparativists about implementation in other contexts, is presidents not implementing things. And that's sort of the Nixon budget impoundment example, but also I think a lot about this with regard to civil rights and non-enforcement of civil rights, and the way that the Justice Department has become especially politicized in the Trump era. So I think it's not just about separation of powers. It's about the implementation power, and it's about, in the US context, I think I'm convinced now from this discussion that I'm not totally wrong, that the US problem is qualitatively different than some of the other presidential problems in comparative perspective, in that at least half of the problem has to do with non-governance. So I don't know if that answers your question, Professor Slater, but that's what I got.
Anybody else want to jump in on this or a later point? Well,
yeah, I want to say something, which is, I think, there's an ongoing debate about the extent to which the president has usurped Congress's lawmaking authority. And my own sense is that train has left the station. They have, and the courts have put up with it, and the rulemaking will continue, unilateral activity will continue. Julia and Kenny both point towards this important issue of implementation, and that the mere articulation of a policy need not translate into a substantial or meaningful change in the doings of government. I want to suggest, though, that is a general problem. It is not just a problem vis-a-vis our assessment of presidential power. Much the same can be said about lawmaking. Much the same can be said about judicial decrees. And so this goes back to, like, what is the relevant criteria by which we want to evaluate presidential power? Is it presidential power relative to the adjoining branches of government, or is it presidential power relative to some kind of fixed standard that we have? Relative to some kind of fixed standard, then it certainly is the case that presidents don't exert the kind of influence you might think that they exert when they exercise these unilateral powers. Relative to Congress or relative to the courts, which are hampered in all kinds of ways institutionally in their capacity to not just pass policy, but ensure its effective implementation. Presidents are pretty powerful, which goes back to this initial point, which is that yes, they're weak, and yes, they're strong. And I don't see how we get around that.
Yes, I like Will's suggestion of a relative understanding of presidential power. So, in comparative, we have this notion of an overdeveloped executive branch. The idea that, the presidency and the executive branch more generally tends to be way more powerful relative to the legislature, right? They have the administrative state behind them. They have way more information. They have, the bully pulpit vis-a-vis an individual member of the legislature, which means that, they can really overwhelm the legislative branch of government, not to mention judiciaries, etc. And so, I think, a relative assessment would help us keep track, because Given that it's hard to figure out sort of how strong a president ought to be, especially because we know that in the process of making legislation, many legislatures actually willingly give up power because they simply do not have the expertise. The Parliamentary Budget Office may not be big enough to handle the entire budget, so they'll delegate that power to the Treasury. They may not have enough climate scientists, so they'll delegate that power. And so because that's just a core feature of the lawmaking process, what we should worry about is the extent to which the presidency begins to outpace other balancing institutions, so that that becomes a relevant dimension with which we evaluate whether the presidency is too strong or too weak.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on this point or related point? Okay. Thank you. Next we have a question. I'll direct this one first maybe to Anne, and then again open it up to the rest of the panelists. What's the significance of formal authority in autocratic political systems versus informal authority, and what lessons maybe might there be for similar dynamics within democracy? So think powerful elite members who may not hold formal positions of power but have some influence in the regime. So thinking about the type of power Trump may hold without a formal position of any kind in the GOP, or media figures like Meng or Rupert Murdoch, other examples.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that there's maybe two different things to think about that kind of come out of your question. So first is maybe like the more direct answer to your question. Definitely people who are formally appointed in autocratic regimes aren't necessarily super influential, and sometimes those that aren't formally appointed may be influential, right? And so I think that that's in line with kind of like one of the big themes of what I was talking about, where it's not about de jure power, it's about de facto power, right? So I think it really comes down to whether these individuals control institutions that really make a difference in terms of maintaining regime stability. So that's part of the reason why military elites tend to be so important in the autocratic context. Another thing to keep in mind also is that leaders will often sometimes shuffle cabinets, right? Or remove cabinet appointees to really affect de facto power, right? So a really common thing that autocratic leaders do is just to basically purge cabinets after they come into power, even when they come from the same political party, right? They might be afraid that their predecessor, is still has influence via the people that they put into important positions within the regime executive, and so it's really common for actually leader successors to come in and basically kind of reshuffle things. But so thinking more about Trump and maybe thinking about maybe like what your question was getting at is kind of like the influence of personalism, right? And like the influence of the perhaps like lasting influence of a really charismatic or leader, or kind of like a cult of personality. So it is really dangerous for political parties to have a really charismatic cult figure. In fact, the most common pathway, a really common pathway for autocratic regimes to fail actually, is for there to be a personalist leader that's in power for a really long time, especially if this leader founded the political party, and the regime often falls apart upon, once this leader usually dies, because they usually don't voluntarily leave office. But it's really dangerous for the regime because all of the institutions are very much just kind of like reliant on the charisma of this person's authority. And importantly, this, charismatic leaders don't usually plan for succession. So, in terms of thinking about Trump, my sense, and like I'm not an Americanist, my sense is that, at least the Republican Party has existed for a long time before Trump. I would say like the most dangerous circumstances is when the personalist leader also founded the party. So at least in this instance, the Republican Party does predate Trump. But I do think it's kind of a dangerous time period for institutions that kind of revolve around really personalist leaders. And I think that the next couple of years, post-Trump are actually going to be pretty critical to see if the party kind of rebuilds itself.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on those points? Okay. It's a question from Professor Jenna Bednar. We've talked about a lot of different institutions as potentially playing constraining role. What about federalism? What role does federalism play in constraining presidents in the US and elsewhere? And anybody else, anyone want to take a crack at that?
I'll say one thing. I mean, there's two quick things. Again, in the spirit of everything cutting both ways, this clearly is a space in which the point about implementation carries forward. When you have, if Biden comes forward and issues a national mask mandate, how is he going to see it actually be enforced? That's going to depend upon, right, local police forces and local forms of oversight and surveillance that have authority into themselves, that it's going to get in the way of his ability to ensure that something actually happens. So federalism can be a constraint. There also are the ways in which federalism can open up opportunities for policy change that would otherwise be stymied when your only options are either acting unilaterally, which can be limited for legal reasons, or courting Congress and trying to advance a policy agenda. And here I would just point your attention to Obama's efforts in education policy, wherein he totally failed to, he couldn't get the votes for much of his time in office to overturn and amend or reauthorize the No Child Left Behind Act, which is something that both Democrats and Republicans disagreed with vehemently, the signature policy achievement of his predecessor. What he does, though, is he pivots to the states, and through a couple of mechanisms, through offering waivers and through offering money, he convinces state legislatures to adopt his preferred education policies. That's something which, using, again, a little bit of authority and a little bit of money, he was able to jumpstart activity that wouldn't otherwise have occurred at the state level, and thereby affect some meaningful change. So it's, federalism, is it a constraint? Yes. And is it a check? Does it also open up opportunities? Yes. Thank you.
Anyone else? Ken.
Yeah, so a quick addition to that is that, from thinking about this from the perspective of an opposition party trying to check the incumbent president, I think federalism provides ample political resources that the opposition party can use as a means of checking the president. In the comparative context, and Anne can speak to this, right? Often what you see is that parties tend to be stronger when they empower, and they can use the powers of patronage to basically swell their ranks and provide all kinds of goodies for party membership. And then opposition parties often languish, lacking money or resources to mobilize. But if you have a federal structure in which subnational units can have opposition leaders, then those can provide bulwarks for maintaining the opposition ranks, and therefore, providing governments in waiting, and that provides the political balancing that you need to keep incumbent executives in check, even under conditions when they've totally captured their own parties.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to combine a couple of questions. I'm also getting them by text, so I'm trying to manage several things here. So we got a bunch of questions that kind of boil down to how worried should we be? So if it's the case, particularly in the U.S. context, if it's the case that most executive actions end up not actually changing much in practice, if implementation is a sort of regular problem with government, if the rhetoric that politicians espouse, even today with Pompeo's press conference, end up mostly being rhetoric and not actually amounting to much in terms of changing the status quo, is this much to do about nothing? Much to do about nothing? Should we be worried? And if so, if the status quo isn't changing in terms of policy, what is it that we should be worried about? Anyone who wanted to jump in on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I think there's two there's two directions in which we can be worried. And one, I think, is the immediate worry about whether the Trump administration is currently executing a coup. And I know that there's been a lot of debate on Twitter among Americanists and comparativists about the technical definition of coup, and I'm not going to try. But whether they're delegitimizing the election results and they're going to hang on to power against the law after January 20th, and the answer is I don't know. I think we are seeing how politics and executive enforcement are linked right now, and they're linked in a way that that I think goes beyond what anyone would have expected 5 years ago. The other issue, I think, is a more kind of broadly structural one, and that is the difference between politics and policy, and the ability, and the other kind of democratic question in the US context is the ability of a government to deliver in any kind of responsive way. And there, I think the president has more potential to be the problem than the solution. I think there is some evidence of this kind of in the ways in which states are experimenting with policies that in some cases violate federal law. I mean, thinking about all of these different drug legalization initiatives, where the federal government, I mean, changing the drug laws from the 70s might not be top priority, but the federal government generally can't kind of address these policies and doesn't seem to have any capacity to kind of move in the direction on many issues that are supported by majorities. It's simply not a majoritarian structure. And I think there the president is poised to continue to benefit from those politics and to continue to kind of talk about things that are popular, or to talk about things that appeal to a certain constituency and to lead rhetorically, but as everyone has kind of pointed out, it's very limited in their ability to deliver on policy. And I think if we think about this as an iterated process that goes on through time, that becomes worse and worse. So I guess I've talked myself into very worried. That's where I'm at.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on the question or on Julia's response?
So Julia, so maybe some comparative perspective might make you a little less worried. So I don't know. Okay, so like on one hand, I'm human and I find Mike Pompeo's comments like very alarming, and I feel very worried as a human being as well. However, just to like play devil's advocate a little bit against this, like a lot of like recent concern and a lot of recent literature and op-eds about democratic erosion. Taking a step back and thinking comparatively, my kind of big message is we have been here before. Democratic erosion and leaders' executive aggrandizement is not new, both comparatively and in the US, right? Like we have arguably all been very authoritarian this whole time. It's just that a lot of countries learned the language of democracy and were hiding it before, right? I would argue that perhaps the biggest change following the end of the Cold War is not this like third wave of like successful democratization. The real story of a lot of global autocracies at the end of the Cold War in the 1990s was that these regimes learned how to become institutionalized. They learned how to appear much more democratic. They learned the language of democracy, and they essentially made themselves much more durable forms of autocracy in sheep's clothing, right? And so we have been here maybe this whole time where leaders have really held on to power. They have not meaningfully let go of power this whole time. And so, that's kind of like how I think about the global trajectory of things, right? Also, just in thinking about the US, again, I'm not saying I'm not saying that what we're seeing right now is not concerning, but we have been autocratic before, right? Like when America was first founded, most people couldn't vote, right? Like we arguably didn't democratize until the passing of the VRA in 1965, right? We've been a democracy for about 55 years, right? And like, I even go beyond like Rob's work on subnational authoritarian. I'm like, we were just flat out authoritarian for a long time here, right? So, you know, and we've had voter suppression this whole time. It was quieter before, or like done with a smile or something, right? And, you know, I think maybe, and you touched on this, Julia, with kind of like norms changing, you know, maybe one of the bigger concerns, I don't know if it's a bigger concern, but, you know, the fact that people now feel very comfortable being kind of outwardly authoritarian, that's maybe like a norm shift that's changed, I think, since you know, this like increase in democratic language in the 1990s. So that's just kind of like my comparative perspective.
Thanks, Sam. I'm not sure that makes you feel any less worried, but that is a good a good perspective. Anybody else want to jump in on that point?
I mean, maybe quickly on this, I think, you know, to echo Ann's point, I think, you know, American political development and political development more generally, right, is not unidirectional. All right, you can go back, and I think the reason to worry is not that, you know, there will be collapse tomorrow, but that, you know, this may be the beginning of an erosion that could get worse. All right, and the thing is, you know, the political incentives for elites often is that once you've put all power in the hands of one person, right, it alters everyone's incentives, and people will start to humor that one person. And before you know it, as Anne mentioned, right, some of the gains that have been made to get rid of the pockets of autocracy at the subnational level in America may be eroded because of what's happening at the national level. So while they, you know, there may not be an impending collapse tomorrow, right? It's important to also be vigilant so that you know, we don't stay asleep as the erosion begins.
Thank you, William.
So having just written a book where the crisis of democracy is in the title, I think I want to point out that populism is emergent in our politics, and not just emergent, but has taken hold of one of the major parties and has found a home in the White House, and that is new. There are the reasons for it obviously have long historical lineages, but we have before us a very real threat to our democracy, and it's playing out on lots of levels. Voter suppression is one that obviously has a very long history. The hollowing out of the administrative state, the denigration of norms, the and what we're going to get off this call and see another atrocity that's happened in the last 90 minutes that is not just tolerated, but it is celebrated by a significant portion of the country. The idea that the people have a deep investment in democracy per se. I mean, I think many people do, but it's not uniformly or held across the country. These are really disturbing trends. And I think, sure, it could be worse, but boy, it could be a whole lot better too. And that the kinds of threats that we see being played out have decidedly not been laid to rest by reference to this most recent election. And both because the groundwork for populism is going to continue, and because the protagonists right now that constitute populism as a movement in American politics aren't going away, means that, yeah, Ken, you're right. Vigilant is the least of it. Absolutely, we need to be.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, we got 5 minutes. I'm gonna try to fit in 2 more questions if we can. So I'll ask you to keep your responses brief. But first, let me direct a question to the two Kens. So what's the role of legislative obstruction? So things like filibustering, quorum denial tactics, slow rolling legislation, plenary disruption, et cetera, in the strengthening or the weakening of presidential policy, power, and authority. Are these activities epiphenomenal to politics and power, or do such things actually impact presidencies? I'm interested in here both from the American perspective and also a broader comparative perspective. Why don't we start with you, Kenny, if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, I don't know that I have too much more to say than what Julia and Will would say, but I mean, in general, these tactics are used as part of the rhetorical reasons for acting unilaterally. And if you run in a survey experiment where you add that reasoning in there, you can get people to support unilateral action at a higher rate. So that rhetoric seems to work. Whether or not it's actually a cause of executive action, I think is probably less clear. It might just be rhetorical window dressing. There are some clear examples, from the Obama administration where they weren't getting what they wanted. And if you, talk to people who were in that administration, they would say, okay, we went to Congress and then Obama came to his legal counsel and said, get me something that I can do on this issue because we've exhausted all options. I tend to think of those as more exceptional cases, but they do exist. So I think of it as a source of aggrandizement. I think the broader point, though, that Will has made, so I give credit to him for this, is that the fact that legislatures are unable to solve some of these major issues creates an incentive for presidents to at least pretend that they are. So that's worth pointing out.
Thank you. Ken, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, just very quickly. I think, the answer here is a bit nuanced from the comparative perspective and from what I know about executive rulemaking in the US context. In that, it depends on whether, Congress or Parliament is relatively strong vis-a-vis the executive, right? Because legislatures can always react to unilateral executive action by actually passing laws to limit presidential action. But when legislatures are weak, presidents can get away with executive rulemaking without any constraints. And this is what I see in the Kenyan case. The other dimension here is that a lot of unilateral executive action is actually not a feature of executive legislative relations, but of interest group politics. So that if you're a powerful interest group, you don't want to go through the legislature, you can get the executive in certain contexts to basically write the rules or enforce existing rules in ways that favor your particular interests. All to say that it all depends on context, right? But as Kenny noted, right, this idea that executive rulemaking responds to gridlock is very powerful, and presidents all over use it as a pretext for what they do.
Thank you. Okay, last question. So we talked quite a bit about institutional checks on, or potential checks on presidential authority. This person's question is about the role of civil society and ordinary citizens. So how do we evaluate the role of citizens in this whole process? It seems that when presidents were blocked by institutions, they tend to directly mobilize their supporters. We also have examples of civil society perhaps being a check on would-be autocrats. So how do we think about the role of civil society? How do you think about the role of civil society as an actor in this process? I'll just throw it open to the group and allow anybody to jump in there if they'd like.
So one challenge that I have noticed in some of my newer research on democratic erosion is I think that there is this tension between democratic procedures and democratic outcomes that we haven't resolved yet. So what I mean by this is I have some newer research on term limit evasion, so how presidents get rid of term limits. And the vast majority of presidents now, both autocratic or democratic, they use legal and constitutional ways to get rid of term limits, right? So things that are kind of completely acceptable if you're just looking at rules, but obviously are kind of anti-democratic in nature, like when we're thinking about outcomes, right? And so I think that there's this kind of tension between, do we care more about democratic procedures or do we care more about democratic outcomes? And I think where this is important in thinking about kind of civil society or using voters as like solution to kind of vote these would-be autocrats out is, I think a potential problem is that voters might not think of these anti-democratic anti-democratic outcomes as democratic erosion if they're procedurally legal or constitutional, right? One can think of a voter as being like, well, the president used a constitutional amendment to get rid of term limits, so that's fine by me. And we could see how this interacts with partisanship, right? So especially if it's like their person, then, voters might not see this as erosion. So I think this is like a tension that I'm seeing that we need to kind of think about, and I think that has implications for how civil society or just kind of everyday people react to overreach.
Thank you, Anne. Anyone else want to jump in on that last point? Ken?
Yeah, Anne is spot on, right? I maybe it's because I study institutions, but I have very little faith in the electoral process as a means of fixing, the risks of descending into autocracy. In part because I think the crisis of democracy is a crisis of people feeling like the system is not working for them, and once that is built in, people are willing to vote for anyone who promises that they will fix the system, and so there's no we shouldn't assume that voters have this sort of intrinsic motivation to defend democracy at any cost, right? They will act in what they perceive to be in their best interest. And if at a given time, enough people think that autocracy is in their best interest, that's what they'll go for.
I'm going to go ahead and bring us to a close. There's much more we could discuss, but I want to thank each of our panelists, Professor Lowande, Professor Opalo, Professor Azari, Professor Howell, Professor Meng. I know people have to get off to other meetings, and to our great audience. I appreciate the time and the questions. Apologies if we weren't able to get to your question. But hopefully this won't be the last time we do an event like this. I wish you all a good night, and we will see you later. Take care.